So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Please be seated. Folks, this text from Mark's Gospel is no Easter triumph. This isn't Easter joy. 3 of the women who were closest to Jesus go to the tomb to prepare his body for burial. These women had been with him as he had made intentional choices about teaching and leading in ways that he knew would get him in trouble. They were with him as he chose to go to Jerusalem, where he predicted his own lynching. These women had watched Jesus' countrymen collude with the empire to invent a story about why he needed to be killed. They had watched him be tortured and mocked. They had watched him die. And they knew they were in danger too. For these women, the grief they felt was trauma on trauma. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome had spent their whole lives under the thumb of an empire that would have killed them without flinching. Just showing up at the tomb was an act of defiance. They go to the tomb, but they find it unsealed, with a strange man inside, a man who tells them, Jesus has been raised. Jesus has gone ahead of you to Galilee. He will see you there. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. This isn't Easter triumph or Easter joy. This text is like a movie that ends before the lovers find each other, before you find out if the accused was really guilty. The curtain drops, and you are left holding the bag, holding the tension, the unresolvedness of the story. The human brain is hardwired for stories that resolve. Trauma and triumph get encoded in our bodies by these brains that have evolved to learn from the past to avoid suffering. Binaries, good versus evil, our side versus their side, pure and impure. Our brains want stories with tidy endings to keep us safe. The problem with these stories is that they also shelter us from all kinds of moral complexity and ethical ambiguity. It's uncomfortable there in the place of ambiguity. It's uncomfortable admitting that you might not be on the side of good or truth or holiness. It's extraordinarily vulnerable to tell the truth when the truth has many sides, when love is on the line, when there might be reason for hope. You step into that place and you risk everything. By definition, you do not know how it is going to turn out. You might not prevail. But that's where the creative power is, in that place of risk. And we get to choose the risk of hoping when hope might be dashed, or the safety of telling ourselves a tidy story that there is no reason to hope at all. In his life, Jesus chose the risk. I like to think that the story of the wedding at Cana, his mother asked him to help out, and Jesus' knee-jerk reaction was to say, I'm not going to get involved. It's not about me. I can stay safe over here. But the part of him that believed in love won out. and that water got turned into wine after all. And from then on, he kept choosing the path of love instead of the path of safety, the risk of healing, of teaching, of speaking truth, of crossing borders and taboos for the sake of believing that God's love is bigger than the power of fear. Jesus learned that creative courage from the tradition of the Israelites. The stories we heard from the Hebrew Bible in tonight's vigil are all stories of creative, defiant courage in the midst of profound loss and vulnerability. The Hebrews who walked themselves into the sea, trusting beyond every bit of their previous experience that God would keep their feet on dry land. The dry bones. The feast. Isaiah's vision of a feast of abundance set in the wilderness, written when everything that people could see was exile and destruction. Paul's letter to the Romans says this impossible thing, that in baptism we are baptized into Christ's death. We have died with him, and we are promised the same resurrection, and so we get to live like Jesus lived, regardless of the consequences to this flesh. Our tradition has pulled that creative courage forward to today, into this vigil. People being baptized make these cosmic promises. Promises about rebuking the forces of evil, the forces that operate on spiritual levels in our souls, but on structural levels beyond our control as well. Forces that are evident right now, today, in this city and in our souls. In the face of all the evidence that this is just how it is, we declare a defiant allegiance to love. And we ask God's help to keep us true to those promises. We tell all these stories, we make these promises, and then we come to the ending of Mark's gospel tonight. It is not Easter triumph. It is not Easter joy. At this point, it's either Easter resignation or Easter defiance. Right now, tonight, we are those women, Mary Magdalene, and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome. It would be easier for them and for us to resolve this story, to let ourselves imagine tenderly washing God's body and laying it in the tomb, going home to grieve, and then move on. You can make that choice. The body isn't there, but you can choose, and we all do, to assume it's around here somewhere. You can choose to tell the tragic tale of what the world does to love, and then you can move on. The human brain needs resolution, y'all, and on any given day, we can only take so much pain and fear. You can chalk that empty tomb up to one more loss and go home. The other choice is harder. The choice to stay in your body with all the terror and amazement of not knowing how the story ends. You can choose, despite all the evidence, to allow room for hope. Hope that love wins. And there are costs to this choice. Allowing room to hope means that what you do matters. It means choosing the vulnerability of telling complicated truths and seeking good news. It means defying the insidious, violent forces that would like you to shut up, sit down, and go along. We all get to choose. Every day. Do we choose to resign ourselves and seal up the tomb and go home so we can get back to normal? Or do we choose defiance? Do we dare to go to Galilee and risk living as if the forces of death and oppression do not have the last word. Alleluia, Christ is risen.